Hello and welcome to the 2019 F1 Strategy Report, powered by Apex Race Manager, the mobile race management simulator. My name's Michael Lamonato, and this is round 9, the Austrian Grand Prix. Well, what a race. Max Verstappen won for the second successive time at the Red Bull Ring, but it was far from straightforward, with a late charge and a perfect strategy lining him up in a memorable duel with Charles Leclerc for victory. But ironically, on a weekend Mercedes struggled, it was Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas who nonetheless played influential factors in deciding the outcome. To talk us through F1's best race of the season to date, I'm joined by F1 editor at Crash.net, Luke Smith. Luke, how you doing?
I'm good, Michael. How are you doing?
Doing very well. I must set the scene. We're in this wonderful, idyllic Austrian farmscape surrounded by, I assume, the Styrian Mountains. I don't know how many mountain ranges there are around here. Not far from the circuit on a Monday, after which Formula One really got everything it wanted after a couple of fairly average races.
Yeah, Formula One is saved. It's wonderful. It's been a difficult start to the year for, I think, F1 as a whole, and we've not seen much action. But Austria delivered, as it seems to every single year now. I mean, I can't remember the last time we had a dull race here. A really, really fantastic spectacle. Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc fighting for victory. That's what we've wanted for, I think, a very, very long time, and finally getting a real taste of F1's future. So, it's saved. We've got the spot back. It's wonderful.
There is something to be said about classic circuits in wonderful settings. A great crowd as well, as has been pretty much since Max Verstappen rocked up, always the case. They're all Dutch. I'm dreading the drive back to Vienna today because I know that they'll be on the roads with the caravans. But something else we should set the scene of. Right now we are outside, extremely sunny, quite warm. That was certainly the theme of this weekend, similar to Paul Ricard, with slightly different effects as we'll get into, but heat and the presence of hot weather really dominated this weekend.
It did, yeah. I think we arrived at the track on Thursday for Media Day, and it was awfully humid as well, and then we had a big rainstorm on the Thursday night, but that didn't really continue into the rest of the weekend. It just sort of paved the way for more warm weather. Every day was about 32 degrees Celsius, so it was very, very hot, and that was another challenge for the drivers as well, managing the tyres obviously in these difficult heat conditions. That was something for them to consider, and it did play a big role, I think, in deciding Sunday's race.
Yeah, I forgot about the rain. Good thing we did, because I feel like it could have been one of those situations where we all anticipate rain that'll never arrive.
And always let down.
Yeah, exactly. But the skies were wonderful and blue, and that was actually to our advantage. Not so much to the advantage of Mercedes, though. We didn't expect them to suffer quite as much as they did because of the heat. But I suppose we, and certainly they, and they've now admitted this, had the signs that this could have been the case from races past. Canada, for example, was a difficult race for Valtteri Bottas because of overheating. And it seems like in a year that Mercedes almost feels like it's invincible, it does have this one weakness.
It does, yeah. And that is something Mercedes have always been very good at. They identify these little areas where they're running a little bit weak, and they obsess over it and work over it. And I think this is something that they will go away and look at. And as you rightly said, in Canada we got a sort of a taste of what could come, and then here in Austria, obviously we're running a fairly high altitude for a European race as well, so that comes into it, and a short circuit, meaning you're always pretty much going to be stuck in some kind of traffic, and it did play a big role that they really had to sort of, I think, pull off some of the performance of the car just to deal with all of these overheating and cooling issues that it was facing. So I think that's something that going forward they'll obviously look at improving, but it meant that for the first time this season Mercedes wasn't the team to beat.
And Valtteri Bottas, Lewis Hamilton, just to illustrate how much of an effect that was having in their race, they were talking about 400 metres of lifting and coasting, which around the circuit, tragic they don't actually have the link of the circuit on me.
It's 4.3 kilometres, so that's like 10% of the track where they're just doing nothing.
Exactly, so it's incredible how much that was really affecting their car. I think Toto Wolff quipped afterwards the only way to get more cooling would be to take off the bodywork. So that's something to keep an eye on, but I mean, maybe we should also be concerned that it seems like every time they have an unusual struggle of a Grand Prix, they always come back extremely strong, so be wary for Silverstone perhaps. Another factor in that, as you sort of said, they're always in traffic at a circuit like this, but I mean, from the beginning, they were going to be behind cars because they did not excel in the way we expect them to in qualifying. This was a pole for Charles Leclerc, his career second, Ferrari's third of the season. looked like maybe that was going to finally deliver his maiden victory. But interesting in qualifying was that we had this real divergence in tyre strategy, even this early in the weekend, where we had, well, I mean, I say divergence, only 3 cars, the 2 Mercedes and Max Verstappen, choosing that medium tyre. And that sort of split opinion amongst the teams and even people watching whether or not that was going to be the right decision.
It did, yeah. And honestly, I didn't see any big gain for it from my point of view. And we've seen other races where teams have done that. And I think a race earlier this year, Ferrari, for example, went for mediums and Mercedes went for the softs. And it opens up some more strategy options. But at a track like here, where the mediums and the softs were actually pretty well matched, it doesn't do you a huge amount of good. So Ferrari went for the softs, and we saw with Charles Leclerc through the first stint that they were able to pull away quite nicely from the rest of the pack, and we didn't see any massive drop-off towards the end of Leclerc's stint, and other drivers through the field as well were able to manage the softs for quite a long amount of time. So I don't think it was that big a deal, but naturally you always want to look like you made the right call, and Mercedes after qualifying were like, oh, it's quite risky what Leclerc's done here, and it was, I think a bit of gamesmanship, really. But, I think for the most part, at a track like this, it wasn't like Paul Ricard, where if you didn't start on the mediums, you would be in big, big trouble. I think it was a minimal gain to be made either way.
C2, C3 and C4 for those playing along at home with the tyres that Pirelli brought to this. Interesting to consider some of the reasons Ferrari was quick here, beside the fact that there aren't very many corners, which seems to be the go with Ferrari. And especially in regard to the soft tyre, which they clearly felt, although there was not so much difference between the soft and the medium, felt was going to be fine on their car regardless of the length of the stint in that opening phase. And we'll talk exactly about the timing of Leclerc's first pit stop in a second, but he seemed like he was comfortable to run a little bit longer if the medium cars did, and it seems to play into this idea that, okay, Ferrari doesn't have great corner performance, but maybe the fact that they're going more slowly through these corners, have terrific traction, seems to be a strength of that car, means that on the softer tyres, they're actually sort of doing okay on circuits like this relative to some of the other higher wear cars.
Definitely, and I think that's been a trend through the year, that once they've made that first stop and they moved on to either mediums or hards, that we have seen a bit of a dip in performance, most notably in Canada when Hamilton was able to reel in Vettel as he did. And I think that does benefit, and I think Leclerc was a little bit surprised after the race that he was able to go as long as he did on the softs. Could have gone longer, as we'll get onto. But we're seeing that Ferrari, on that soft compound, they are able to, I think, just push a little bit more, work a little bit better. And this weekend as well, they shifted their philosophy a little bit, so they put a little bit more downforce on the car, and they were able to manage that really, really well.
That certainly played a part in Leclerc's race. If we go into the race strategy itself, we should highlight first of all that Lewis Hamilton did start slightly further back than he expected, though did make up a position from Max Verstappen's terrible start, which ends up being terrifically ironic given that he won the race, spoiler alert. But we'll talk exactly about how he got there momentarily, because this first phase of the race really set up Max Verstappen's win without him being involved at all. This was purely a race at this point between Max Verstappen and the Mercedes, and with a numerical advantage and not realising how much they were going to suffer in the heat, which they also said they sort of underestimated a little bit, maybe because it was slightly hotter on Sunday than it was during practice. But they used that advantage to be able to pressure Leclerc into stopping earlier than he would have liked. We saw Mercedes split its strategies. Bottas in second pitted early, despite having on the mediums. Lap 21 it was, while Hamilton continued to run. And that meant that Leclerc, he had the soft tyre, you would have expected him to stop early, but really had that tyre life, Ferrari said, to run longer. And suddenly his last stint is quite long, which played a role towards the end of the race.
Yeah, and towards the end of his first stint as well, he said to Ferrari, "Let me know when I can start pushing." So he wasn't going to, the full extent that he could at that point. And they gave him a target that he was already running 0.3 under. So clearly he was sort of saving up, I think, quite a bit to push towards the end of that first soft tyre stint. And but then, as you say, Bottas came in and Ferrari had to react to that. So we saw Leclerc come in one lap later. And obviously it's a standard thing. And at that point, they were really looking at Bottas, who I think was about 3 or 4 seconds behind, as being the main rival for victory. I mean, Hamilton was another couple of seconds back, not really in the picture. Verstappen was 13 seconds off, so you wouldn't even consider him being an option. So Ferrari, we give them a lot of stick for their strategy calls this year, and a lot of questions about what they've done at certain races. But I think here they played the game perfectly. Hindsight's a beautiful thing, but I think they were right to focus on Bottas and react to him as they did when they did.
Ironically, it was the pace management early in the race that sort of hid Mercedes' problems. It would become obvious when people started pushing towards the end of the race and the field started bunching up, because Bottas looked like he was going to be more or less there, as you said. Okay, it seemed like he wasn't quite on the level of Leclerc, and we know Leclerc was conserving, but everyone was kind of shadow boxing a little bit in that early part of the race, not willing to blink first, and Mercedes took the initiative again because they had that numerical advantage. Then after that stop, with Hamilton running long, it seemed like maybe he was suddenly going to be in the box seat because he was very comfortable in those tyres. He radioed his team saying, his tyres felt good, he had plenty of room to go, and then all of a sudden the pace dropped off and everything started to go wrong for Mercedes pretty much from this point.
Yeah, and at that point I think we were looking at Hamilton as being a serious contender for victory, because he was doing the strategy that ultimately won Verstappen the race. He was planning on doing that long first stint, maybe try and get a bit of an overcut, but at worst, he ends up getting much fresher tyres for that final stint of the race. He was pushing on, matching Leclerc for pace, even though Leclerc had new tyres. An error at turn 10, which has caught out so many drivers this weekend, running over the curb, causing a little bit of damage to his front wing. And we saw his time start to drop off at about a second a lap to the others. And Mercedes took the call and pitted him earlier than they wanted to, had to do a front wing change as well. And from there, it was game over. I mean, P5 was where he came out, and that would be his end result as well.
It was a 12-second stop, so costing you at least 6 seconds pretty much. And then the overheating that came to bear meant he was essentially out of contention. When he made that stop on lap 30, it was Max Verstappen who inherited the lead, when only one more lap on his soft tyres and then pitted for new hards. And this is where suddenly the race turned in a completely different direction, because Leclerc had stopped earlier than he could have, was on used hard tyres as well. They weren't new hard tyres that he switched to. And Verstappen, that Red Bull car, just seemed to be so happy on that compound. Maybe it was just Verstappen, considering that the other Red Bull car didn't seem as happy. That's perhaps another story altogether. But just made absolute mincemeat of the top three in a way that, well, imagine if Hamilton had that kind of performance, or imagine if Leclerc had been able to run longer. He almost embarrassed them for how much faster he was than everybody else.
Yeah, it was incredible. And I think, strangely, we didn't see this coming because of his FP2 crash on Friday, so we couldn't look at any long runs and go, oh, Red Bull are looking good on the hard sit. He was just on another planet to the rest of the field on Sunday. And he had, 10 lap fresher tyres compared to Leclerc, which doesn't sound like a huge amount, but as you say, with Leclerc using used tyres as well, that adds another few in. And he was able just to get it all hooked up so well. And Leclerc said after the race that he was pretty disappointed overall with his race pace, but it was the degradation on those hards through that stint that really hurt him. So for Verstappen just to be able to have, I guess, all the freedom to push, it was a masterful display coming through the field, some lovely overtakes, but also just really good management of his tyres, because I mean he still had 40 laps to go to get to the end, which is that's no small feat. So a massively impressive display from him.
It is just such a step forward for Verstappen compared to maybe only a little over 12 months ago. Of course, 12 months ago he did win this race, but not long before that, you would easily have expected him to bottle these kind of moves. We had, so Valtteri Bottas didn't put up too much of a fight, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Sebastian Vettel tried, but ultimately that car didn't have the pace at that point in the race. Then we had this great battle with Charles Leclerc, who obviously wanted his maiden victory. He had pole, would have been a very good result for him. But Verstappen was so collected. And I do want to highlight, not so much lap 69 when the pass was made, but lap 68. We had this superb battle up at turn 3, which really just gave this great vision, I suppose, into what Formula One can expect from this next generation. Both only 21 years old. Yeah,
it's incredible, isn't it? And on that lap, we saw Verstappen, the lap before, try to move. Leclerc defended pretty easily. And this time around, Verstappen got his car up the inside, looked to have the move done, but Leclerc hung his car out wide, got better traction exiting the corner, was able to just pull back ahead and get the position back on the run to turn 4. And it was just a great fight between them, and that's what we want to see moving forward. And obviously we had the touch when Verstappen did make the final overtake for the lead, and all that followed with that. But again, that was, and the stewards ruled correctly, it was hard racing, and that's what we want to see. And I think on Verstappen, as you rightly say, it's a maturity that 12 months ago 13 months ago, we may not have seen, because with Vettel, it took him, I think, 3 goes to get past, but he was patient. He wasn't going to jump it. He wasn't going to make a mistake or crash. He was patient enough to do that. Bottas didn't put up any fight first time around. Leclerc, that was a 3rd go as well. And that's what we want to see from Max. Like, ultimately, he knew he had the time. He knew he had the pace. And also, Leclerc himself knew that he said after the race that even without that touch, he wasn't going to keep the position because Max was just so much faster.
So that's how Mercedes ultimately decided the race. Well, I shouldn't say decided, but had a fairly substantial influence in the outcome of this race and helping Max Verstappen to win. I do want to touch back on Bottas, though, and Sebastian Vettel. It was the quiet and very, very brief fight for the final podium place. But it came about from what seemed like another strange Ferrari situation. It started with that pit stop for Vettel on lap 21. It was slow. It was about twice as long, 6 seconds long. As it should have been, twice as long as it should have been, I should say, because there was a communication error in the garage.
Apparently the radio didn't work.
Yeah,
so.
Ferrari finding new and inventive ways to make mistakes, despite this race actually being fairly good for them. And that resulted in him being a little bit off the fight for the lead. But then this second stop, which he was the only one of 2 drivers, I think it was, the only driver who was really competing for points, I should say as well, who made a second stop, stopped onto the soft compound tyre on lap 50 just after he was passed by Max Verstappen. Seemed like, I don't know, an unusual way to perhaps try and get the fastest lap point, maybe just have a bit of a fight with Hamilton. But this actually was extremely clever from Ferrari because it put him in the battle for the podium in a way he wouldn't have been just challenging Leclerc on the same set of tyres.
Yeah.
Bottas, I should say.
Correct, yeah. Strategic brilliance from Ferrari, which is incredible. And it was, again, they just thought on their feet and that they saw that the Mercedes was struggling so much. Vettel obviously was struggling with his hard tyres, was easily picked off by Verstappen. So yeah, they thought, well, if there's that much of a gap to Bottas, why don't we just try and get another set of softs on? At worst, yeah, he was always going to pass Hamilton and then go for the fastest lap as well. So it's a chance to get an extra bonus point. And in the end, yeah, he came, I think, within 6/10 of getting that final place off Bottas. Which is really what I think Vettel and Ferrari deserved. I think they were both supreme all weekend long. Vettel was so unlucky in Q3 to have an issue that meant he couldn't qualify properly. And from 9th, he picked his way up the order nicely. So the 2-stop strategy, a bit of a weird flex, but okay. And it was, but it worked, and it was the right thing I think for Ferrari to do at that point. And that also, if we'd seen Vettel running 2-3 seconds a lap quicker or whatever, that would have also been good for Leclerc's race as well, to sort of say, right, well, this could be an option. I think Ferrari, they deserve a lot of credit for, I think, everything this weekend, apart from their radio malfunction.
Yeah, someone changed the radio station perhaps in the garage. To touch on how Bottas approached this, there was a little bit of criticism for Valtteri Bottas for not putting up much of a fight, as we mentioned, against Max Verstappen. Verstappen was substantially faster, but hey, it was a fight for the podium. Maybe you expect him to fight a little bit harder. But when it comes down to those 0.6 of a second at the very end of the race, it sort of puts that a little bit in perspective, doesn't it? Because had Bottas lost even an extra lap fighting Max Verstappen, perhaps those 0.6 of a second would have been reversed. He said it only would have taken maybe an extra lap or so, considering the state that Mercedes was in that weather, for Vettel to overcome him. So actually if we want to be kind at very least, some astute driving from Valtteri Bottas in that regard.
Definitely, yeah. You've got to pick your battles, and I think just be aware of the race that you're in. And I think Bottas knew at that point that he was never going to win that race. Verstappen was in contention, so yeah, why put up the fight? What's the point of putting yourself in a bigger hole just to try and keep the position for another couple of laps?
So we can say a rare congratulations to Ferrari for maximising pretty much this race, even if they didn't achieve victory or even a double podium in the end. But still, some good decision-making, if not for one or two small problems. So the podium was Verstappen, Leclerc and Bottas. Sebastian Vettel was close behind, followed by Lewis Hamilton. But in 6th place was I'm running out of superlatives. Superb, let's just go with that. It's pretty boring. But anyway, Lando Norris for McLaren. This was just, he ran a different strategy to most other people. It seemed like an error at one point, qualified quite high, lost some positions early, made them back up. This was just sort of a perfect race for him, though. Him and McLaren, it should be said, because we'll talk about Carlos Sainz in a moment, but it doesn't seem like there's anything McLaren can give Lando Norris to do that he can't do.
Yeah, and it's incredible for a driver of, 19 years old who's in his rookie F1 season. And we saw, I think, most clearly with Stoffel Van Dorn, just how difficult it can be to make that step up. But Lando's kind of just taken it all in his stride and with real aplomb. And it was a brilliant drive from him. I think he made an incredible start to sweep up as high as third at one point, ahead of Lewis Hamilton. Again, you got to pick your battles. He knew he couldn't fight with them at the front, but he was able to get ahead of Kimi Räikkönen, which was important. And from there, managed his race perfectly. But when he came in and fitted the mediums instead of the hards, it did seem like an error, and it seemed difficult to see that he would be able to get to the end of the race. I think he had to go 45 laps roughly on that set. But he did it, and it was a perfect display from him, I think, to get home as he did. And ultimately, Pierre Gasly has been struggling this year, but that Red Bull is still significantly faster than the McLaren. Lando was able to just deal with it very easily and never really looked at risk of losing sixth. So an excellent display, and I think deserves a lot of credit for how he has started life in Formula One.
So lap 25 stop off his soft tyres, having qualified in Q3. No, you got it right, because then he ran, I guess that's 45.
Oh yeah,
quick
wow,
maths
okay.
is not so great. No,
wow.
you got to bang on.
Just
putting in the details. Running on that medium compound tyre, and I suppose this goes to the fact that despite having, of course, the 3 different steps of tyres, they were all relatively evenly matched. It depends on how the car chose to work the tyres, but the medium tyres made it very comfortably to the end with Norris, and that speaks, of course, to his ability to manage them. But it was interesting that towards the end of the race, he even said that he had enough reserve. Of course, he was keeping Gasly behind. He was keeping Gasly behind for most of the race, from around lap 35. That's a great amount of time to hold back a car that's faster than yours. But had enough in reserve to never feel like, had Gasly gotten an extra power mode or whatever, well, they're running the same engines, he wouldn't have been able to defend against it. In fact, it speaks to that fact that he set his fastest lap, I think, on the penultimate lap of this race. So there was plenty of left in that tyre. It's not as if he was really ragged on the edge. And I suppose as much as that speaks to Norris's abilities, this is a big step forward that we're now sort of confirming over the last maybe 2 or 3 races for McLaren after having so many years of being essentially nowhere.
Yeah, and we're now seeing them, I think, firmly as the 4th fastest team. And this midfield fight, for all of the talk about how close it's been and how it's a couple of tenths between being 4th and being 9th, and the last few races we've seen, I think, a very clear trend that it is McLaren who are the 4th fastest. They are the midfield leaders, and another really strong double score for them in Austria. They're now 20 points clear of Renault in the Constructors' Championship, and a long way ahead of the other midfielders. So it's incredible, I think, for a team that, as you say, have struggled for so long in F1, and after all the changes last year going into this year, there may be some concerns about, well, who's been involved in the design process of this car, are people in the right places? The MCL 3.4 is a very, very, very good car, and in all areas. I mean, even sort of like looking at straight line speed and things like that, we saw Norris able to hold his own throughout this race, in previous races as well. So, I think they deserve a lot of credit for how they've recovered, and it's really exciting to see them fighting so high up the order so consistently. And, you've got to think that if it wasn't for the bulletproof reliability of these top 3 teams, that a podium isn't too far off for them.
Yeah, an interesting thing to consider, actually, because, you've got to think that maybe one day we might get some kind of reliability problem amongst the top 3, and then McLaren would be perfectly placed. It seems strange to think they'd get on the podium, but hey, it's been that long for them, hasn't it? Gasly finished behind Norris, as we've said, but Sainz also put in an excellent race himself, because while Norris more or less managed to hold the position he qualified in, Sainz started from last. He was from the very back with an engine penalty, a full power unit change, a start from the back penalty, which means he climbed, 12, 13 positions, a lot of positions, one way or another. Did this with I suppose we can call it the true contra strategy. While we had a couple of drivers, Max Verstappen being one of them, running long on the medium tyre, no one ran quite as long as Sainz, and Daniel Ricciardo, we'll be talking about in a moment relative to Sainz's performance, ran to lap 41 on the medium tyre before switching to hards. And again, I suppose this just underlined how comfortable that car was on all of the tyres, because he only dropped down to, I think it was 13th after his stop, or maybe 15th, then recovered really easily with hard tyres that were much fresher than everybody else's, so sort of hyper version of the Verstappen strategy. Sliced his way through there and only finished not so far, anything 10 or 11 seconds behind Pierre Gasly. We've talked about Pierre Gasly in episodes past, so I won't be tempted to do it again, but to finish almost, let's effectively say 1-2 in this Class B, despite finishing last, just really underlines how impressive that car is and these two hungry young drivers.
Definitely, yeah. And I think Sainz said after the race that he picks up a little bit of front wing damage late on, so that even stunted his charge even more. And just again another excellent display, and it did prove once again that how that long first stint would benefit you later in the race. But as you say, just shows that this car, it can deal with anything, really. It's a very well-rounded car. It's not a case of some circuits it clearly works and others it doesn't, which the other midfield teams, that is the case. Haas still trying to get to the bottom of their issues. Racing Point Renault really, really struggled this weekend. McLaren just seem able to deal with anything right now, which is, I think really testament to, as you say, not only the car itself, but also the two fantastic young drivers.
As a point of comparison, let's end with Renault and Daniel Ricciardo, who they didn't qualify very well. They didn't look happy at this circuit, did Renault. I think Ricciardo identified that there's some kind of fundamental issue with the car on this type of circuit, or perhaps more generally considering the inconsistency of that team. We only have to go back 1 week, and when they were looking very good, we were suddenly talking about Renault finally consolidating fourth place. He ran a very similar strategy to Sainz, having started higher up, albeit. In the middle part of the race, just before Sainz stopped, so let's say around lap 40, he was only 4 seconds behind Sainz. He ran, however, till lap 46, then chose the soft tyres, I guess deciding that was how long the soft tyres would be really aggressive for. He lost a great deal of time, 15 seconds in waiting to make that stop. Didn't end up so far back. He ended up 6 seconds behind Sainz, but out of the points by 4 positions. It shows that car is just does not have that same ability as the McLaren, I suppose. And Ricciardo sort of hinted afterwards as well that perhaps the strategy should have dictated an earlier stop. Not the first time he said something similar, and perhaps indicating a little bit of a lack of match fitness, if you like, in the Renault strategy department. Yeah,
definitely. And I think Renault obviously is going on this big rebuild right now, and Ricciardo's arrival being a huge part of that. But there are operational things that you do have to work on and you do have to get right, I think, to begin with. And something such as this is very, very important. I think Ricciardo's maybe adjusting to life in a smaller team after so many years with Red Bull. It does mean that certain things will slip through the net, such as this. And it was, I think, there was a chance for them to just, I don't know. It was a difficult weekend all round for them, but they could have maybe tried to be a little bit more sensible with the strategy and just, I guess, played it safe and followed what looked like the sensible way to go. But it just didn't work for them in the end.
Just a weekend to forget for Renault, but a weekend to remember for many more teams, not least of all, of course, Red Bull Racing. And we should say, as a quick final note, Honda's first win as an engine supplier otherwise since 2006, a long time coming. Some teary scenes.
Yeah.
You've got to love the Japanese. And that's a big result, not just for the fact that this is Honda's first win, but this does, I suppose, signify the entry that we've now had all 4 engine manufacturers win in this era. Of course, the era is coming, I suppose, in some respects to an end in not too distant future, whether that's just chassis or otherwise. But a big boon for competitiveness in Formula One.
Definitely, yeah. And after all the struggles that Honda have had through their return in F1, it was really good just to see that they finally got it right, and they've worked so hard over the last few years to recover from the difficulties they had with McLaren, and then signing this Red Bull deal. There were still some doubts and concerns, but just a massive result for them, and it proves that they may not have quite the performance of maybe any of the other 3 manufacturers, but they are close enough so that on a day like Sunday, where the stars align just enough and you've got a driver like Max Verstappen in your car, that engine is more than good enough for victory. Really, really well deserved. I think their first since Hungary 2006, wasn't it? Of course, yeah. And it was the first front row since San Marino 2006.
I see.
So.
Very good.
They deserve it because Honda have worked so hard, and as you said, some sort of teary scenes in the paddock after the race, which was lovely to see because they care, and that's how hard they've worked, and they've really been through the ringer. You could have easily forgiven Honda for saying, look, it's not worked, we're going to go, but they stuck at it and they've got what they deserve now. Verstappen said after the race that he felt that it would maybe remove some doubts that people had about this Red Bull Honda project going forward. But I think one other thing that was on my mind just after the race was that I wonder what this means for Verstappen's future on a weekend where discussions about an exit clause and things like that in his contracts have come up. For him now to have won a race and be third in the championship, which seemed to be the 2 rumoured triggers to say there is no exit clause, he's now got it. So what does that mean for next year and his future? Is it now decided? I don't know. But yeah, a really big day for Honda. I think they can be excited for the future moving forward as well.
Yep, it's a big day for Honda, big day for Formula One because it's fixed. You've heard it here, not first, because everyone's been saying it. We'll wait and see how the next race goes in Silverstone. But Luke, it's been a pleasure to catch up with you in such an idyllic setting.
Yeah, definitely. We'll have to come back here next year.
That was Crash.net F1 editor Luke Smith. The Strategy Report is powered by Apex Race Manager, the mobile race management simulator. Play it now for free on iOS and Android devices. And if you want more Strategy Report, you can get every episode by subscribing on Google and Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on your favourite podcasting app, plus all of your socials. And if you like what you've heard, we'd love it if you could give us a rating and a review to help other F1 fans find the show. The Strategy Report is a Beer Mogul podcast, and if you're looking for an alternative take on the Austrian Grand Prix, have a search for Box of Neutrals in your podcast app of choice to hear Rob James and I declare that yes, F1 is finally saved. I've been Michael Lamonato. Look me up at Michael Lamonato on Twitter, and I'll catch you in a couple of weeks for an analysis of the British Grand Prix.